Now, of course, for us to get to the race of 83% renewables, you need to put them somewhere. And you see, that's always an interesting issue because none of the teals, none of the greens suggest that any of this infrastructure should happen where they live. Instead, it should go into Airbnb country. The only problem is normal people live there and they are starting to arc up at the amount of stuff that is being built, whether they like it or not. Put simply, big renewable energy, with the help of its local state government, acts as a steamroller. Well, tractors were used by 100 people who were fighting against wind farms in the north of Victoria. And believe it or not, there are even people in Tasmania, where it is already 100% renewable, who say there's certain parts of land that should never be used for renewable energy farms because, well, of course, they're so damn precious. But the other problem is one no one can avoid. If you looked at just 1 minute of time and you took a snapshot of how much energy was being produced once the sun went down tonight, this is how many megawatts are being created by coal and gas. And yes, a little bit of renewables. But at night, at 6 o'clock tonight, 29,936 megawatts. Write that number down. 29,000 megawatts of power are being created. But the problem is, of course, that if you move entirely to a renewables-dominated market, that as soon as the sun disappears, that goes. As soon as the wind dies down, that goes. So you obviously have to store it. Now, again, let's have a look at some data. The world's biggest battery isn't in South Australia. It's about to be built in New South Wales. And let's go to that far right-wing talking point, the Sydney Morning Herald, who wrote about the world's biggest battery. The world's largest grid-scale solar battery with a potential capacity of, write this number down, 1,200 megawatts. It's 8 times the size of the big battery in South Australia, and it'll be built to the northwest of Newcastle. So let's do some maths. The world's biggest battery equals 1,200 megawatts. 1,200 megawatts. At 6 p.m, we were producing 29, almost 30,000 megawatts. So you're going to need more than the world's biggest battery. In fact, just to store what was made at 6 p.m. tonight, and you would fill the batteries like that, you'd need 25 of the world's biggest batteries, and that would cost at least $800 million. But of course, we know the cost will be way higher than that because, of course, New South Wales is the state where it costs $25 million to put an extra flagpole on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Now, none of this is an argument against doing anything. It just means the point I've been making for 10 years is as relevant as it has ever been. That's called the cost of transition. Now, if government wants to turn around and say, we're going to borrow $6 trillion so we can pay for it, okay, but they didn't promise that. Instead, they said that they can rewire the network for just $20 billion over 10 years for a project that the CSIRO have already priced at $1 trillion. So the market will do its bit. Private companies will come in. Hedge funds, superannuation funds, all fine. But the costs have to be passed on to someone. And the someone, you guessed it, either way, is you and me. Oh yeah, and meantime, there is a bloke whose perspective on this I deeply respect, and he has taken on the trolls on Twitter about it, and he's in the mainstream media willing to talk about the cost of transition, not whether we should transition or not whether or not climate change exists, but the reality of the reality versus the promise versus the slogan. Chris Uhlmann has written in the past couple of weeks about this very thing. He's, of course, Channel 9's federal political editor, and he will be on this show tonight. I hope his Twitter is turned off for the next little while. Oh, yeah, and meantime, just another little inconvenient truth to quote the Al Gore movie. The University of Adelaide has belled the cat about one of the problems with wind turbines. In fact, most wind turbines that have been built in the past 10 to 20 years are coming to the end of their life cycle. And guess where they're going to end up? In landfill, which last time I checked isn't a particularly wonderful environmental outcome. Again, I read from that far right-wing talking point, the ABC's website. A study led by a professor has indicated that tens of thousands of old turbines could end up in landfill by the end of the decade. Worldwide, there could be 40 million tonnes of blade waste in landfill by 2050. Remember when we're all going net zero? Wind turbines have a lifespan of 10 to 20 years. They're expensive and break down due to their size and the fact that they're made of a mixture of composite materials, including glass fibre, carbon fibre, polyester, and epoxy resins. It's very difficult to recycle. Oh yeah, and there's a little problem with solar as well. Again, one nobody wants to talk about, but we'll talk about it here. We'll be called climate deniers for talking. Again, I'm not denying climate change. I'm not suggesting there's not a need eventually to transition to better technologies, but I'd like them to be better technologies before we actually transitioned from the ones that have worked for 100 years. I know, shock, crazy. Well, that far right-wing talking point, the ultra-left-wing Foreign Policy magazine, has written about that slave labour in China, mostly the Uyghurs, is responsible for a huge amount of solar panels that feed the world's need to move to renewable energy. Remember, 83% in the next 7.5 years here in Australia. Let me again quote from the far right-wing talking point of Foreign Policy magazine, which when it's not writing about Donald Trump, occasionally says things like this. A troubling reality, in fact, clouding the sunny outlook for solar energy is its dependence on Xinjiang province. As Politico in the US recently reported, most of these cells originate in that region, and it has gained worldwide infamy for the violations of the Uyghurs' human rights. So interestingly, today, the very same administration in the United States that would like to replace fossil fuels has now said that they are going to put a ban on imports from China that are made with slave labour. If this is one of the great sources of solar power, how is anyone going to get anywhere near 83% in the next 7.5 years? If the environment is the reason to do it, then why would you bank on a technology that needs to eventually be put in the ground like an old mattress? Oh, but that's all okay. We can store it in batteries that could cost $800 million or 25 of the world's biggest batteries to store what was just being made, not in the middle of the day when the sun was blazing and the wind was roaring, but once the sun had gone down. How much energy we use would flatten those batteries very quickly. So again, welcome to the real world. Welcome to the inconvenient truths. And for how long will the environmental movement of this country stand by with more landfill? Or are they okay if the climate solution that goes on their house was built by slave labour in China?